Hey, everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers Podcast. And today I have a guest. It's Marek Doyle. He is a nutritional therapist. I guess we could say a functional nutritional therapist because he uses a lot of the same strategies we talk about in functional medicine to help people with chronic health conditions get better. Marek, how you doing today? How's sunny? Where are we at? Ireland? Is that where we're at?
We are in England, so in the garden of England, Kent, so just outside London, but nice little country spot. I can hear birds cheeping outside my office, so that's got to be a good start, right?
Fantastic. So we got you on the podcast. We're going to have a discussion today about thyroid physiology, maybe bring up the concepts. I often talk quite a bit about cellular and tissue hypothyroidism, have a discussion about that. But for the listeners, can you give them a background of who Marek Doyle is? Some people across the pond may know the name Marek Doyle pretty well, but obviously I'm in the US and some people may not have heard of you yet. So who's Marek Doyle?
So as you say, I'm a functional nutritional therapist. So I've been doing this for a little while, 16 years. And what's really fueled my journey is that continual question of why are certain things working so well in some individuals and not in others. And naturally, that's what pushed me down the route into personalized nutrition. So, in that regard, I've continuously married up the data from many different test results from individuals to their individual outcomes, and that's just allowed me to create a model of personalized nutrition that can easily separate not what is good, but when is a certain approach likely to be good and in who, and that's really what dominates my thinking when I'm working one-on-one with human beings.
Yeah, so I think what you said there was probably a key thing. Hey, personalized healthcare or personalized nutrition. Unfortunately, that's not typical of the allopathic model. There's nothing wrong or just to disparage the allopathic model. The allopathic model works really well for crisis care, for acute care, for life-saving care, for management of chronic diseases. But that's really different than what we do in functional medicine or in nutrition, fitness, in the health care industry, which is a bit different from the allopathic kind of sick care industry, right? And so in that model, you can treat a condition because that's how everything's kind of structured, but that doesn't really work well across the board with people to restore health. But it's good for managing labs or managing conditions. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and I think you've touched on some of the main issues there, in that there's never been a better time in the history of humanity to be hit by a car, because the emergency care that we've got is incredibly advanced, fascinating, the various techniques and the ability of both the surgeons and the hospitals to actually keep people alive when previously that may well not have been the case. Unfortunately, applying that model to healthcare has not really worked out. And obviously, it's very easy for us to just accept that, that's how the healthcare system works. But this is a system that's only really been in place for 70 years. So in terms of how it sits in the grandest scheme of humans and healthcare, this is largely experimental, and it's overseen the most spectacular decline in human health ever recorded. So it's not to say that it is all bad, but clearly we should be asking questions as to what's missing. And a huge part of that is this lack of focus on why are we seeing the symptoms, the patterns, and the problems that we're seeing, instead of focusing so much resources on trying to get a diagnosis, then running through the physician's desk reference to determine, you either get this drug or this drug. So let's hope one of them works.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, and that's the crux of the issue is we put way more time on the diagnosis and the treatment and management of a condition and less time on how did we get here. But that's really what we should be doing. That creates that space for functional medicine. We just need to get more of the allopathic community to realize there is potentially another approach. And I've had a medical physician on my podcast, and he kind of explained it like, hey, I didn't even know there was this alternative universe of functional medicine that existed until he had heard me on a podcast somewhere, and he was like, that doesn't sound like what we do. That's something different than I'm doing on a regular basis. And then we were able to have a discussion, kind of talk about his health issues and get kind of to restore some of those issues. But I think the other thing, before I really get into the meat of it, because you do what you do, I think one of the big problems we have overall is we don't have a really good definition of what health means. So I know I'm putting you on the spot. You didn't come in with an answer to this, but what I want to get from you is what's your definition of health. And I want to say before you answer it, what I don't want is the standard that you read, right? Health is a state of wellness. Okay, so what's wellness? Well, wellness is a lack of disease. Well, no, it's not, right? So you see people use wellness as the definition for health, and then you also see them use health is the definition of wellness, and then they use the absence of some pathology or disease as an indicator of health.
Defining things by what they're not.
Right. So you line up 10 people all in various states of weight and disrepair, right? And all of them have no official diagnosis of any disease, but you have an elite athlete here and you have Joe Average here. And are they both optimally healthy? So give me your Marek Doyle. If you're the head of the universe for healthcare, you need to set a different definition of what health is or means. What is it?
Okay, I'm going to take a stab at this, and I'm going to phrase it as freedom from unnecessary limitations that are set by our biology. Mm-hmm. So it's to say that, we have no unnecessary limitations on how good we can feel, how sharp our brain may perform, on our ability to engage in physical pursuits. So it doesn't mean that we're automatically performing fantastically across all those areas, but our physiology is not creating undue limitations. We are free to develop and explore and engage in whatever activities and processes that we wish, without being pulled down and pulled back. How about that?
Good. So I think it's a good stab at it. We'll keep it down. I've got a book coming out that in the probably early summer as it looks now, as we see, and I also take a big stab at trying to provide a better definition, right? Because it's interesting. I had somebody come on and say, hey, I'm really healthy, but I just need thyroid medication. I said, well, then you have a level of health, but you're not optimally healthy. Because if I put you out in an environment without your medication, what happens? Are you going, you need that medication, right?
Yeah, you are not free to cast ashore a beautiful island and just roam free for several days, unless you also have taken with you those very key supplies, in this case thyroid medication.
Right. So I like to use, along with your concept, self-reliant, adaptable to your environment, right? So there's a level of health. It's more of a spectrum than a thing, right? And everybody's got a level of health. And you've got the person who says, hey, I don't have any diagnosis, but I'm adaptable to my environment. I don't require anything else. And I'd say, okay, then you have a level of health. You're probably up on the positive side of the scale. But if I put you in we're going to climb a 12,000 foot peak today, and you don't do any fitness, then I would say in that environment, you have a different level of health than the person who's adaptable to that environment, right? So everybody can be healthy in the environment they're in, but how healthy somebody is how adaptable they are to more extreme type situations. So I think it's a scale, and I take a stab at it in my book, but I'm glad to get your definition, because I like people to understand, I think, that health is not just I either am healthy or I'm not healthy. It's a scale, as well as illness is a scale, right? And
absolutely,
and the loss of health
of
is
course,
a scale.
yeah, thyroid function. I look at that as a scale, a spectrum, shades of grey.
Mm-hmm.
Very much we see this tendency towards black and white thinking, as in I have thyroid issues or I don't have thyroid issues. It's a natural human trait, but it's certainly amplified by the focus on diagnoses within allopathic medicine. I think whereby people, when we're talking about insulin sensitivity, people think that you are insulin resistant or insulin sensitive, rather than recognizing the shades of grey, and how even in the same person different organ systems can demonstrate different insulin sensitivity. But I digress.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we don't look at it like you're either insulin resistant or you're not, and we assume that all tissues regulate the same, and they don't. So we'll get into that, but before we do, just so that the listeners understand, like, you're helping people in clinical with their health in general. What are the types of clients that you typically work with on a general basis? What are the type of clients? What are the conditions? What are the complaints that are the things that people are coming with to you for help for?
So now, and pretty much from the majority of the last decade, it's very much the chronic, complex cases. These are the individuals who just haven't been able to get the answers that they're after. They know something isn't right. They're feeling all manner of limitations, but either the diagnosis and the ensuing treatment that they've received just hasn't done the job, or, as is the case for just as many, they don't fit into any particular box. And even worse, they'll often be given some real limited tests that don't necessarily have much bearing on the patterns that they're experiencing, and then told those famous words, well, everything looks okay. That tends to be the archetypal client. That's about 90% of who we work with right now. So there's always a huge need to build that picture, that metabolic map for each individual at the start, rather than simply create a list of what's wrong or what's out of balance or what needs fixing, so on and so forth. The more important focus in these scenarios has always been, well, what right now is limiting these individuals from moving to the next step? What's their initial milestones, and which obstacles do we need to focus on to get them there?
Yeah.
So that's has a big impact on the initial focus.
Yeah, I'd say when I've been doing this a few years, I think I'm on my 27th year of doing this functional medicine thing, and this is where you're supposed to say, "But you look really young," right? That's what you're supposed to say.
I was about to do that, but I didn't want to interject.
That's okay. So but a lot of people come to me because they're like, "Hey, I think I've got a thyroid problem. I need you to fix my thyroid," and I look at what's going on through maybe a different lens, a different window. And I don't look at people as, hey, you have a thyroid problem, you have a gut issue, you have an adrenal issue, you have a hormone issue. I look at it as the big picture. You've got an excessive stress response going on, and your physiology is adapting to that excessive stress. And you should expect to have gut issues in an excessive stress situation. You should expect to have hormone issues. You should expect to have thyroid signaling changes. All these things are adaptable changes to the excessive stress response. And so when somebody says, like, okay, what's wrong with me? Like, okay, you're trying to fix your thyroid physiology, but your thyroid physiology is adapting to a bigger picture. And I will use a term that I coined and say, listen, you have a multi-system adaptive disorder. That's what's wrong with you. Multiple systems are adapting to some load of excessive stress. Your issue isn't your thyroid initially. Your issue isn't your gut initially. That becomes the problem with like chronic issue. But ultimately, what's the underlying issue is creating your excessive stress load that's triggering this danger physiology, right? Do you look at things similar?
100% identify with that, because if there's 2 points that often come up in clinic and see me, just reframe things. Firstly, it is, as you touch on there, this idea that I don't know what it is about my body. It's broken. Whereas actually, in all cases, I don't see any evidence of that. What I do see is that the body is desperately trying to adapt to the signals that it's receiving. Mm-hmm. And it's trying to do that in scenarios where there just isn't enough resources to meet the demands. And thus, we're seeing multiple compensations deployed. The body's on economy mode. It's trying to save energy. It's not investing in the digestive tract. It's trying to limit the metabolic usage of energy. And obviously, thyroid regulation plays a huge role there. We're seeing alterations in the way the central nervous system and specific areas of the brain are given permission to work. And all of this is how the body was designed to respond, given the environment that it finds itself in and the signals that are occurring as a consequence. And equally, as you touched on now, I will see a whole range of people who've had, these long journeys that have seen multiple allopathic practitioners, the alternative practitioners, and they've trialed, a protocol for liver detox. They've trialed, the adrenal support. They've gone down an entirely different route, maybe with acupuncture. They've undertaken heavy metal focus, all of this, and their reading now takes them to a place where they think, actually, this website that talks about candida issues, this absolutely fits what I'm experiencing. Well, mainly. And of course, they say, I know what it is now. I just need to clear the candida out. Mm-hmm. But of course, I'm saying, well, actually, no, we need to alter the distribution of the resources in your body so that first you can maintain healthy conditions in the gut. Therefore, we are not providing a super friendly environment for those microbes, should they even be there. And equally, that there's sufficient resources so that your immune system is going to be able to get the energy signals from, say, the thyroid and the permission it needs via the central nervous system to actually engage in a sufficiently strong response to deal with it. So, yes, I actually do expect that's a huge part of the issue and is driving a number of symptoms that are playing havoc. But first of all, let's give you a fair chance of responding to that sort of protocol. And that's where, we're looking at that fundamental platform. If your body's in a fight or flight response 24/7, there's not a chance that we're ever going to see investment in the gut to an extent that the conditions allow for the results we want. So, start at the start.
Yeah. So I look at, and I kind of look through the lens of something called the cell danger response. Are you familiar with that, Dr.
Navo's work? Dr. Navo's, yeah.
So I talk about it quite a bit on the podcast. And for the listeners, I'll give you my general simplified version of it. This is how I typically explain it to patients. And cells are like people, right? They operate in one of two primary modes. They're either in a low stress, we call it homeostatic regulation, where they have enough energy to do everything they need to do. And the primary role is manufacturing. We're making cell membranes, we're making hormones, we're making enzymes, we're making ATP, we're burning fat, we're burning glucose, we're making muscle, we're just making stuff, and life is good. And you feel good, right? And to do that, and tie it to thyroid physiology, to have a high manufacturing state in the cell, in the tissue, in the body, you need a lot of T3 getting to the receptors inside the cells, because that's what generates the metabolism. T3 binds to receptors and turns on those manufacturing processes. But T3 also binds to receptors inside the cell that turns off certain processes. And a lot of those processes that are turned off by T3 binding to it are these immune, inflammatory, defensive mechanisms. Why would the thyroid hormone turn those off? Well, if life is good and I've got all the energy I need and I don't have anything to fight, no infections, no organisms, no terrorists, no nothing, turn those systems off, put energy to the thing that makes the most sense. But if I'm a cell and I'm perceiving danger, whether it's danger signals from emotional stress, from trauma, from organisms, from toxins, from reactivity to food, something that's creating this danger physiology, then what I want to do as the cell is say, whoa, let's turn down the manufacturing process and let's ramp up the cell defense processes. And the importance of that is, because if I keep manufacturing things inside the cell and I have an infection organism inside that cell, guess what I do? I provide more resources for the organisms, right? And so a virus doesn't want to kill you. It just wants to get in the cell and have a great place to live. It's like the Unabomber. Once it's in there, nobody sees it. You can steal a bunch of resources and then spew toxins out that creates chaos, but it's kind of hidden and protected. And that's really what the virus wants. It just wants to thrive and survive. And so we often look at physiology like it should be always in homeostasis, and it's not. And we look at thyroid physiology like it's either all on or all off. And in reality, cells that are perceiving danger are going to have, typically, depending on the functions and the tissue, certain tissues are going to be and functions are going to be down-regulated in a stress response, and certain tissues and functions are going to be up-regulated in a cell. And T3 plays a huge role in regulating that physiology. So I always look at people and try and explain that cell danger response from kind of that perspective. How do you look at the cell danger response in regard to, or explain it to your clients? Is it similar, or do you have a different way to explain it so people can get the concept that, oh, my physiology is running differently because of this stress response?
Yeah, so I often speak in terms of resources, and probably the easiest way to actually frame that with any accuracy is I'm looking at how much energy is produced by the mitochondria, how well is that communicated through the various energy signals of thyroid, insulin signaling, leptin. That pretty much is a great metric for, our resources that are available, minus what's stolen by the stress response and the inflammatory response, both of which are hugely energy intensive. And so what's left over is pretty much what I am referring to. And that has major implications on vagal tone, which has such an active role in providing permission for these processes that you mentioned, those that aid in our health and our future well-being. So digestion, detoxification, the activation of that front part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, the single most energy intensive area of the body, one that's so vital for mood and for thinking and planning and taking part in all the activities that we want to do, but doesn't help keep us alive immediately, here and now, in a confrontation. So that's often the framework that I would immediately apply, the lens that I would use in order to sum things together. But of course, there's multiple layers that we can look at it. And of course, to hone in on the cell danger response, what's going on at cellular level, it's always going to have such an intimate relationship with what I've described, which is more of a system-wide, more of a general tonic way of looking at things. And so, yeah, in that regard, is there inflammation? Well, suddenly, yeah, we're going to see the oxidative stress that comes with that, and potentially cellular damage, the production of the various compounds, the danger associated molecular pattern, the DAMPs that Navio speaks of so eloquently in his paper. But equally, yeah, if there is a lack of energy, then we're going to see a huge compensatory response, one that's not ideal and one that comes with costs. Again, more damage to the cell. So the interesting thing is that what I always find so beautiful is how, whether you look at it from a cellular level, it all makes sense. Any challenges that the body's not handling are going to result in a very reliable production of the DAMPs and PAMPs, danger-associated, pathogen-associated signals that activate the immune system, that activate the danger response. And suddenly, yeah, that's communicated systemically. Equally, if you look at it from a resource perspective, it's the same things that are overwhelming the system and the system's resources that will ultimately result in this change in behavior. So yeah, that multi-level system that's coordinated and linked in, they're both equally valuable in order to help us understand, but also help us predict what is the likely response here, depending on what intervention and support that we apply.
So one of the things that somebody might think about when we talk about energy resources is they may say, look, I'm 40 pounds overweight. I got lots of energy resources. So what are you talking about? I've got energy right here. It's all around my midsection. If it's about, and I agree with you, but I want to clarify, help the person think about this a little bit, like, hey, I'm eating calories, I'm storing calories. If it's only about energy resources, why don't I just burn the fat? Why am I gaining weight? And when I'm in this stress situation, what's your thoughts on that?
So yeah, really good point, and a really important point as well, because I think that ties in so well into the most relevant misunderstanding when it comes to body composition, burning fat, losing weight. And so in that regard, where we're going to see the body determine its choices in how it uses its energy and how much it uses, it's all based on this one sensor in the hypothalamus, which is constantly reading the available energy. So that's where that energy signaling comes into place. Because yeah, this is a perfect example in obesity where there is loads of energy beneath the skin, but how much of that is available? And consequently, what impact does that have on energy signaling? So yeah, in these scenarios, we will often find that due to insulin resistance, due to impairments of either cortisol and estrogen receptors within the fat cells, something that I think is very complex, but really powerful to actually exploit when it comes to getting fat out of cells and permitting weight loss. And that's in men and women, these estrogen receptors. Yeah, in this regard, now we can actually pull levers that allow the brain to recognize that there is enough energy, because when there is this poor insulin sensitivity, well, not only does that impact on the movement of fats and encourage them to accumulate in fat cells in the liver, but also we're going to see less signaling in the hypothalamus, the area that determines, are we sufficiently fed or are we starving? And in that regard, it is so useful to recognize obesity as a starvation disorder. The body won't ever store excess fat unless it sees it as useful. And it's only ever going to be useful to do so, which of course involves reducing your power to weight ratio, reducing mobility. It's only ever going to be worth paying those costs if there is a defined and clear risk of starvation. The human physiology simply doesn't add excess weight unless it deems there's a benefit to doing so, and that's the condition in which it does so. In other words, this is a scenario where the brain is starved of energy or perceives that it is starved, and so it slows down the usage and induces metabolic changes to ensure that the next opportunity that comes along to store it, it's going to be stored. And that's exactly what we see. So in that scenario, yeah, I am always so disappointed to hear all the advice that people have received to just cut calories. Of course, we're adding further starvation signals to ongoing starvation events.
So I guess this wasn't necessarily the direction I was going, but I do want to dig into this a little bit, because I think this is where you and I might differ a little bit. That when we talk about insulin resistance, I hear people talk about, well, the reason you have this weight gain is because you have the insulin resistance. And if you fix the insulin resistance, then you'll be able to put glucose into the cell and tissue. But my argument is, why does the person have insulin resistance in the first place?
So, yeah, again, this is an area that I suspect we could probably go into for hours, but yes, so vital, because ultimately the cell will only ever induce insulin resistance as a protective mechanism. In scenarios where your mitochondria cannot process the food compounds, these energy compounds, at sufficient rate. So the single most common scenario that I come across is where we're seeing cellular hypoxia, lack of available oxygen at the cell, and sometimes that's caused by anemia. Iron shortage, B12, folate shortage, potentially contributions to copper, etc. But more often than not, this is where we've seen a maladaptive response, a maladaptive stress response that's opened up the gut lining, allowed endotoxins from the gut to pour into the circulation, which seems so potent in inducing a particular type of inflammatory cascade, one that's dominated by nitric oxide. Nitric oxide can be extremely helpful in the right places, but when the immune system are pumping out nitric oxide in particularly large amounts, it can dilute the availability of oxygen. Now, of course, the mitochondria, specifically that electron transport chain that does the energy making, that combusts those electrons from food with oxygen from the air, well, that cannot actually proceed at the pace we want. And so we get this backing up and stacking up of these highly reactive energy compounds, and that's not what we want. They're highly reactive. They're going to cause damage to the mitochondria. And so that's where the mitochondria deploys what we call that retrograde signaling, and the end result being that, well, not only are we seeing less energy production, which is problematic, but also we're seeing that down regulation of insulin sensitivity to protect the cell. And that process can also be initiated if there is excessive oxidative stress in the mitochondria, which would entirely replicate the same issues, these signals that the mitochondria is constantly assessing. So, of course, there's a number of ways that we can actually see these issues occur. And, whilst I've mentioned these as downstream consequences of inflammatory events or imbalances in oxidative stress, it's also relevant that, pure and simple overnutrition, slamming lots of glucose into the cells, is also going to be able to force these cells into a defensive response. And unfortunately, that's the only one that we tend to see getting any focus when most discussions on insulin sensitivity occur. In other words, individuals are told, well, just, cut down on your carbs and you'll be fine. But of course, once these self-perpetuating cycles have kicked in, those that do induce the inflammatory response and the oxidative stress, the poor mitochondrial function, which in doing so forces the body into further stress responses, further opening up of the gut lining, further inflammatory responses, the nitric oxide pattern that I mentioned. We're not going to get out of that until, we do start piecing together the central pathway that's involved there. And equally, what specific obstacles does each individual have that are going to be pouring fuel on that fire, that are going to be perpetuating that and tending to them? So that oxidative stress, oxygen availability, insulin sensitivity, I think there's so much of a conversation to be had there, and so useful to actually integrate that into how we do things on the front line, because yes, it's complex, but it gives us clarity on what do we want to do to change the course of these patterns in each individual.
So for the listeners, let me kind of summarize this and kind of condense it a little bit. What we're talking about here is when Marek's saying, hey, it's insulin resistant, the things that gets the most discussion about is the reason somebody has insulin resistance. And what does that mean? That means a cell is not listening to the insulin signal to pull glucose into the cell. Okay. So most of the blame gets put on, you just eat too much carbohydrates, you're eating excessive amount of carbohydrates, you're not exercising enough, so eat less carbs, exercise more, and it's only about the cells are stuffed with glucose and they can't use any more. That's why they become insulin resistant. And when we listen to you, our clients, most of you have already kind of tried that solution and said, hey, I've done low carb. I'm not eating a lot of carbohydrates. I've gone paleo, I've gone carnivore, I'm not eating carbs, and I'm still showing signs and symptoms of insulin resistance. So how could it be, right? How am I pre-diabetic when I don't eat that stuff? And so I want to help you understand what's really going on here. This is glucose resistance, okay? And we use insulin resistance and glucose, lack of glucose tolerance, but it's all resistance. So the bigger question is, in optimal physiology, if you're in homeostatic regulation, how homeostasis should work when it comes to metabolism is that you put calories into the system. And if you put more calories into the system than the body can use in a moment, and you start storing calories as in your adipose tissue releases a signal called leptin. Leptin goes to your brain, and leptin tells your brain, hey, we're not hungry anymore, stop eating. And by the way, we're going to kick the activity centers off so that you get a little bit more active, a little bit more restless. And two, we're going to trigger increased conversion of T4 to T3, because leptin in a low state is an activator of something called deiodinase 2, which is the primary converter of T4 to T3. And so if you are in true homeostasis, okay, and this is, again, not black or white, but a grade scale, then the more calories you eat, the more your metabolism should rev up. Now, is there any evidence that this is the case? Yes, you all know somebody who eats more than you do and is lean and skinny and doesn't seem to put weight on. And you all know somebody who eats less than you and maybe is bigger than you, right? So, but how physiology should work, we have systems in place. The more I eat, the more my metabolism should increase, the more I turn off the signals, and it's a cycle that kind of feeds itself. The problem occurs is that when you start to have these stress responses, these danger responses, it's not all or none, but this is a progressive chronic load that occurs. Then what happens is metabolism starts to slow. And when we start to slow the metabolism in the cell, we said we decrease the conversion of T4 to T3. If there's an actual danger mechanism, then one of the things that a cell in danger will do will stiffen the cell membrane and reduce oxygen coming into the cell, as Marek was talking about this hypoxic state. That hypoxic state triggers an inflammatory mechanism, and that hypoxic state also triggers the activation of an enzyme called deiodinase 3 that then deactivates T3, which decreases the mitochondrial function, because you need T3 to drive mitochondrial function. And you might say, well, why would the cell do that? You guys were just talking about energy, energy, energy. And the reason is if I have a threat in a cell, one of the things that cell wants to do is increase free radicals, because those free radicals are part of the defense mechanisms to kill the bacteria or virus inside the cell. But we don't want too much oxidative stress, too much free radicals, overwhelming what we can kind of manage inside the cell. So what does the cell do? It turns down the primary mechanism that generates energy with oxidative stress. We don't want the oxidative stress from the mitochondria and the oxidative stress from the danger mechanism, because that may be excessive and damage and kill and destroy the cell. We don't want to kill the whole cell. We just want to kill this little organism, right? And so when we're talking about insulin resistance, when you look at it through the cell danger response, and Marek can jump in here and correct me if he thinks about it differently. But when there's a cell danger response, hypoxia can trigger. Like if you're, like I talk to people about breathing, if you don't have good respiratory behavior and you don't get oxygen off a red blood cell into your tissue, that's going to create hypoxia and danger response too. So we'll get to that. But when we have insulin resistance or glucose resistance and we're gaining body fat, the reason we're typically doing that is typically because there's some type of cell stress danger mechanism going on. And what's important for people to know, especially those that I'm eating low carb and I'm still showing these signs, to get glucose into a cell requires glucose transporters. And guess what? Those glucose transporters need to work appropriately. They need optimal levels of T3 inside the cell for both the glucose transporters that are insulin dependent and the ones that are insulin independent. So let me tie it together. You have a stress response going on. Your cell deactivates, reduces the amount of T3 in the cell. Now I don't transmit in a fasted state. I can't get glucose into the cell as well as I could before. So now the ability to get glucose in the cell is not very good because I don't have the T3 in there to help drive it in. So what do I need to do? I only have one hormone that helps me get glucose into the cell. So what do I need to keep a little bit higher circulating? I need more higher circulating insulin to activate the insulin-driven glucose transporter. And so you start to see glucose build up, then more insulin stays in circulation. That's why your fasting insulin is higher, which then lowers your glucose. So it looks good, but you got a higher insulin, but normal glucose, higher insulin, normal glucose, higher insulin, normal glucose. And now glucose and insulin are higher, and somebody's telling you you're pre-diabetic or insulin resistant. So I think for the vast majority of people that I see, cell stress is driving their decreased glucose transport, this insulin resistance. We store more body fat. And for those of you who are saying, how come if I'm always got all this body fat, why am I always hungry? Because there is a point that leptin becomes excessive. And just like insulin resistant, you become leptin resistant. And now the leptin signal's not helping the brain. The brain says, hey, I'm not listening to that signal. So you're always hungry. You need a lot of glucose because you don't have those mitochondria to generate energy efficiently. And that leptin no longer works efficiently to activate the deiodinase 2 enzyme. So that further complicates the issue. So that was a ton of stuff to say. Marek, let me have you weigh in on what I said and give me your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think that it really speaks to, how all of the details, they're complex.
Mm-hmm.
Human body's exquisitely complex, but the principles aren't, in the sense that if the cell is being asked to do more than it's capable of, for example, if it has a limited budget for oxidative stress, well, we'd rather it uses up that budget to handle the oxidative stress from producing energy in the electron transport chain of the mitochondria. Wonderful. That's going to see very reliable, pleasing energy production that's going to nourish each and every cell. But of course, if there's inflammatory events that are causing a lot of oxidative stress, well, that budget now needs to be shared. There's a distribution of how the body is going to handle that. So it has to slow down the speed at which energy production occurs so that it doesn't overstay the budget. Now, of course, that's going to reduce flow of energy through the mitochondria and therefore going to force the cell to protect itself with reduced intake of glucose. And therefore, we've now got the insulin resistance that means the rest of the body doesn't actually think it's being fed when it is, doesn't have the regulation of the thyroid system that we want, and can equally mean that the insulin can cause mischief with increasing inflammatory activity in immune cells that may well not develop the same level of insulin resistance. So we get all these issues that can so easily be put down to, my body is broken, it's not working, it's not doing what it should. But of course, as is always the case, it did exactly what it was evolved to do, to maintain cellular integrity. It had a limited budget for oxidative stress. Now, if a certain demand is forced upon it by ongoing dysregulated inflammatory responses, well, the cell adapts. It adapts in the best way it knows how. It just so happens there's further consequences. And again, if that's sustained long term, well, then we may well see that impacts on the insulin resistance, but equally we've got lower energy production anyway. We're suddenly at a point where the body doesn't feel like it's got enough energy to meet normal demands. And of course, what is the stress response? The stress response occurs to get more energy into circulation so that you're better equipped to meet the challenge coming your way. Whether it does or whether it's simply a predicted challenge is by the by right now. But in any case, more stress response. So that means more adrenaline to further drive up the glucose in the bloodstream, which was already pooling. Then we've also got more opening up of the gut lining to try and grab at those sugars and salts, but inadvertently letting in more of those endotoxins from the gut into the bloodstream, and further inflammation. We've got ourselves a cycle there. And so, whether, of course, this cycle starts because of a stressful event or sustained stress at work or interpersonal conflict within a relationship, buried trauma within the body, anything that's going to activate that stress response is relevant. It's going to come with the same behavior, the same metabolic shift. It's going to come at the same cost that can influence the mitochondria doing what it's doing. If it costs it the ability to grab that oxygen, then it's forcing that slowdown. It's now going to mean that, we have those signaling defects, the inflammatory events, which are going to further activate the stress response. So, it can start from stress, or maybe it can start from a lack of key mitochondrial nutrients. In any case, it could start from inflammatory exposure, mold, oxalates, lectins, etc. So in most cases, what we're looking at is too much of a specific insult, one that drains the resources of the cell or pushes it beyond its limits, forces it into behavior which short-term is adaptive. But if it's forced to continue, then there's going to be downstream consequences, which in most scenarios are actually going to drive this cycle that I speak of And this is where we see individuals enter our clinic. And it's with this framework in mind that it now becomes clear as to why just running some antimicrobials and some probiotics isn't cleaning up the gut. Within the realm of this chaotic cycle, there's no opportunity to maintain the right sort of conditions in the gut to either support the colonization of the good guys that we want, or even to make it an unfriendly for the undesirables. But equally, we're going to inevitably force the body into down regulating its thyroid activity.
So let's
try and save energy.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because people have been taught to believe that they don't have a thyroid problem until their thyroid gland is dysfunctional, high TSH, high free T4. I kind of look at that differently. We say like 5% of the population has hypothyroidism. Maybe 10% have hypothyroidism and subclinical hypothyroidism. I think those numbers are way underreported when we consider the fact of tissue and cellular hypothyroidism and the cellular physiology, and why so many people have chronic hypothyroid signs and symptoms, but they don't have a dysfunctional thyroid gland yet. So I look at it from a spectrum perspective. I'm always looking at the cell level first. So I look at it from a cascade of cellular tissue hypothyroidism. If that's short term, that's great. There's always some ebb and flow there. If that stays chronic, then you start to get more tissues getting involved, more tissue hypothyroidism. You typically then start to see more of a downregulation of the thyroid gland, thyroiditis, and eventually we see the thyroid gland become dysfunctional. It's a loss of 90% function of the gland. We diagnose as primary hypothyroidism. Allopathic medicine looks at it from top down. The problem only occurs when there's no hypothyroid symptoms until the gland has lost 90% of its output. Where do you see it? Do you see this as a more, and obviously it could be somebody, I radiate my thyroid gland, it's top down, right? I get my thyroid gland removed, that could be top down. But do you see it top down from the gland, or do you see it really as a cellular issue first, and that maybe there's a lot more people struggling with chronic hypo and hyperthyroid symptoms despite being told that they don't have a thyroid condition?
So the way I look at it is it would actually be neither top down or bottom up, both of which obviously have a lot of value to add to the picture that we're building. I would always look at it in regards to the layers. So of course, the most discussed layer is the stimulation that goes to the thyroid gland and its response. Now, unfortunately, when most of the individuals I work with come in with previous thyroid results, one thing that sees my palm meet my forehead on a regular basis is that they have only measured TSH and T4, or in some cases only TSH. And I think with the buzzwords that we throw around, evidence-based medicine, which of course we could go off on a tangent as to its strengths and its weaknesses, some very distinct weaknesses. But we're not even at that point when we see these results, because the evidence going back as far as the 1970s is that TSH and T4 testing is going to miss at least 80% of all thyroid problems, primarily because the pituitary gland is responsible for that TSH production, and it has its own unique system. It's independent deiodination system, which means it's always well supplied for T3. Its own transport proteins, they don't respond in the way that the other transport proteins respond across the body. It's got a privileged production system, so it's almost never going to show a reduction in T3 levels in the pituitary gland until, as you say, things are really, really bad. So I wouldn't necessarily ever look into that with any certainty, unless, of course, it does show a problem, in which case we know that things have got quite bad. But in most cases, yeah, I will see people with some raging thyroid system issues. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with their thyroid gland. It's doing its job exactly as we'd want. Normal level of TSH is stimulating it. Normal level of T4 is being produced. The focus areas that I see most often are in the next two layers, one of which is the deiodinase system, the regulation of how much of the barely active T4 gets turned into the active hormone T3. So, yeah, that's a really key point. It's a really relevant area that pretty much acts as the accelerator for the entire system. And there's so few points that are so important to determine function across the brain, the liver, the muscles, and the immune system. Every single cell is subject to this one enzymatic conversion. And of course, that's why there's so many factors that it responds to. Perhaps we'll get onto that. And then, of course, we've got the final layer, that uptake into cells, which is, of course, more something that if the cell hasn't got the energy to run those transporters, or it's shut down because of fermentation toxins or because of excessive fatty acids or the bilirubin, and that's where we see the problems. But one thing that's probably useful for perspective for the viewers is I ask everyone who comes to see me to take an organic acids test before they do. And in chronic cases, 1 in 5 people has raised levels of malic acid, which is one of the best indicators I've found for cellular hypothyroidism.
Okay, because that was one of my questions. So the first one was, do you look at it as a top-down or a tissue issue? And I think from what I got from you is, hey, we obviously want to see if there's a gland dysfunction. In some cases, there's overt gland dysfunction, commonly called primary hypothyroidism. But in a lot of cases, there's signs and symptoms of tissue hypothyroidism, and the gland is still working fine. And the reason that you can have a functionally working thyroid gland and still have hypo or hyperthyroid symptoms is because the individual cells and tissues self-regulate independent often of other tissues. So one tissue could be hypo, another could be in a more hyperthyroid state because they all have the ability to regulate. They all have the separate transport, slightly different transport mechanisms. They have different concentrations of the deiodinase enzymes that do the activation or deactivation. And a key point for the listener is they have different types of thyroid receptors, and that makes a huge difference when it comes to regulating thyroid hormone. The thyroid receptors in the hypothalamus are thought to be 10 times more sensitive to thyroid hormone than in the peripheral tissues. That means your hypothalamus can get regulated much faster with a smaller amount of thyroid hormone than the peripheral tissues. Why would that be beneficial? In a stress response, what is the thing I need functioning quick? I need my brain. So hypothalamus quickly activates, quickly converts T4 to T3, takes a very small amount. And once the receptors in the hypothalamus are saturated, what kicks in? Sympathetic nervous system kicks in. And now here we are able to defend, fight or flight. So I wanted to kind of get into the looking at tissue and cellular hypothyroidism. So you started into that, and I wanted to stop you because I want to highlight that for people. But this is important for the listeners. You're going to go to your GP, your endocrinologist. They're going to run a TSH and a TSH probably with a reflex to free T4, and they're going to say, "Hey, this is why you might only see a TSH and no free T4, because if the TSH is within the reference range, no free T4 is done." So your doctor probably ran a TSH with reflex to T4. You might say, well, you guys are going to talk about other numbers, or you're talking about other numbers. Why would not a good medical doctor, allopathic physician run more of the panel? If they're there, why wouldn't they run them? The answer is really pretty simple. The medical guidelines state, simply put, that treatment for hypothyroidism shouldn't begin until the gland is hypothyroid, which means that TSH is lab high, free T4 is lab high, and that's technically when treatment and primary hypothyroid begins. But the literature shows that to get to a TSH above lab range and a free T4 below lab range, you've had to have lost greater than 90% of the function of the gland. That is not the beginning of a thyroid problem. That is the end of gland function. But you can have both hypo and hyperthyroid symptoms with or without a functional gland. So it is important to us in functional medicine to look at other indicators of thyroid physiology: T3, free T3, reverse T3, free thyroxine uptake, T3 uptake, T3 uptake, thyroid antibodies, right? We want to see all those things. So Marek, when you're looking at labs, you said malic acid is a great indicator of tissue hypothyroidism. So explain to me, to the listeners, why malic acid would be a good indicator of tissue hypothyroidism, and then what other, let's say, thyroid panel indicators and what maybe other indicators are just on a general blood chemistry panel you might look at to confirm a tissue hypothyroid state.
So yeah, the reason why malic acid can be such a nice clue is because malic acid is subject to onward processing by an enzyme called malate dehydrogenase. Now, what stimulates that enzyme? T3. And it does so inside the cell. So it's not the only enzyme for which we can gain measurements, but that's the one that is on the organic acid panels in pretty much every single panel you'll see. So highly accessible and yeah, very relevant. How a good 20% of the chronic issue individuals I see will show that. So straight away, we've got total clarity staring us in the face that regardless of what else we do, regardless of the nutritional support or the neurotransmitter balance we might create, regardless of what steps we take to support digestion, however good sleep hygiene is, if that's not attended to, there is absolutely no chance that their cells will ever have enough energy to do their job properly and get beyond basic survival tasks and towards the tasks that we wish to attend to, e.g. healing.
So tell people what malate does in the cell, or malic acid is what's the function and purpose of that, so somebody understands, because they're going, malic acid, malate, what is that?
Yeah,
so tell them what it does.
In terms of diagnostics and getting a picture, the most important thing is it showing signs of low T3 activity? It does have a functional role as well, which is part of the Krebs cycle. So when we talk about the mitochondria, essentially, we're talking about, I would look at 3 stages: the input into the Krebs cycle, then the Krebs cycle, which is this biochemical dance that strips these food products down to their most basic components, which is, of course, the electrons that are then fed into the electron transport chain in phase 3, the third and final phase of what's going on in the mitochondria, and also the phase where energy is actually produced. It's also the phase where oxygen and the electrons are combusted together. So malic acid plays a big role in that middle phase, the Krebs cycle.
So people who are listening, let me just interrupt. In 7th grade science class, in biology, you learned about the cell, you learned about the Krebs cycle, and you learned about electron transport chain. You didn't really want to learn because it was this cycle with all these reactions, and everybody hated it. But it's important because when you're tired, when you're fatigued, and you're talking about, do I have hypothyroid symptoms because I'm tired and fatigued? The mitochondria pulls a glucose molecule in, and for this one glucose molecule that it pulls in, it generates 36 ATP if it does it aerobically. Okay, so that's a lot of efficiency from one molecule. But to be functioning optimally aerobically, we need oxygen and we need T3. So if we have a low T3 state, low oxygen state, low T3 state, we're going to not generate as much energy. Matter of fact, we reduce the function of that Krebs cycle. We reduce the amount of flow through that electron chain, so we get less ATP and less energy. The body in a stress state favors an anaerobic respiration, which is a faster way to make energy. It's just not going to generate as much energy. There's actually potentially a net loss that occurs. So the Krebs cycle is still working. The mitochondria is still working. It's actually, I don't want to get into the efficiency of it and all that stuff. It's too technical. But I think the key that's important here is when we're talking about this malic acid on that organic acid paper, when you see that elevated, that's an indicator that the Krebs cycle is not functioning as smoothly as it should. It's not working optimally. And the most likely reason for that is there's a low T3 state. We're going to talk about some other ones, but I do want to get Malik's thought process in, because there's a controversy here to some degree as to how to address that. And some people would say, well, obviously, if there's a low T3 state and the cell's not converting T4 to T3 efficiently, the solution here is to give that person T3, and that'll make this chemistry work. Are you thinking along those lines when you're talking about we have to restore that? So tell me, when you see that, are you thinking, I just need to give them T3 to make this work? Give me your thoughts on that.
So I'm always looking at, let's say I've undertaken the clinical screen. I've got an idea of where they're at, and I've spotted all of the usual signs that we'd associate with hypothyroidism. We've got the organic acid results back, and they show that rise in malic acid. So suddenly, we are piecing together something here. We know that the thyroid signaling at cellular level is a problem. Now, that can only occur because either there isn't enough T3 in circulation, as in poor activation of T3 via that deiodinase system, or because there is enough T3 and it's not getting into the cell. So my first step would be to then take a look at a thyroid panel. And that will tell us which of those two scenarios we're looking at. Bearing in mind, it could always be a little bit of both. In any case, what I would always want to do, first off, is tend to the obvious obstacles. So, of course, if we're seeing that there's poor conversion from T4 to T3, that is to say, the deiodinase activity has slowed down, then I want to take a look at, well, is there any inflammatory obstacles we can tend to? Is there a lack of sleep and therefore growth hormone production? Are they eating enough calories? So often that's going to come up, and then it's one of those things that will never fail to surprise me. Often people will have been to sometimes dozens of practitioners, and no one's actually asked them to write down what they're eating each day and then the amounts. I've seen tons of people who, when actually we calculate it, they're only eating 900 calories a day, and they thought they were on tons more. But so we're looking at those obvious causes that might downregulate that effect: stress hormones, estrogen and testosterone, insulin sensitivity, iron, zinc, and selenium. So investigate those, and there's always going to be at least some of those that will come up. And then when it comes to the entry to the cells, is there any obvious obstacles there? Is there either excessive adrenaline or insulin resistance, both of which can drive up fatty acids in different mechanisms? That could reduce the uptake. Is there any fermentation of amino acids in the gut that's now spilling into the bloodstream and impacting on that? Is there any obvious limitation to ATP levels in the cell, by which we're mainly looking at energy intake again, calories, or mitochondrial performance? Is any one particular mitochondrial nutrient missing? And so often, there will be. So that's where I would start. I would tend to those obvious obstacles, and then we'll look at retesting. Okay. And a lot of the time, we'll see things that were problematic before, they've disappeared. They're no longer a problem. Sometimes we'll see them improve. And if they remain resistant, then that's where I will likely refer to a doctor for a prescription. I'm a nutritional therapist, so I don't prescribe that. So sometimes that's required to essentially compensate and kickstart the energy production system so that they can then respond to those steps that I've just mentioned. But
yeah, so I think the reason I asked the question is because there are some people that say, hey, if there's poor T4 to T3 conversion, the first thing we need to do is just blast this person with T3, and that's going to fix the T3 levels and they're going to be better. My issue with that thought process is, yeah, there are some people that may have difficulty converting T4 to T3, but the vast majority of people, if they had true polymorphisms of the deiodinase 2 enzyme, like that enzyme didn't work, then they would have T3 deficiency from start, right? So that I don't buy that often. Some people say, well, if you just load them with T3, then that fixes the issue. And I think that's like playing whack-a-mole, just like T4 is, because the same enzymes that are going to deactivate the T4 and not convert it to T3 are still there, are still going to deactivate T3. The plus side to T3 is that T3 can get converted to a couple different forms of T2, and some of those forms, or one of those forms of T2, can actually be a backup to T3 and drive some of that mitochondrial function. So there is a benefit, but I don't think that's the way to fix it. So I wanted to see if we were on the same page there. So we're short on time. So I just want to have somebody, we talked about malic acid. On a general thyroid panel, what are the things you would look at on there for a sign of cell or tissue hypothyroidism?
Well, on a serum panel, I would obviously look at reverse T3, which is normally a hint, but I wouldn't ever look at these markers in circulation, because by definition, if there's cellular hypothyroidism, there's a difficulty in uptake, then we're looking at a discrepancy. So I would look more at a standard panel of TSH, T4, T3, antibodies, reverse T3. And then just consider, are there any obvious factors, be it disturbances in gut and signs of excessive fermentation? Is there any issues that could contribute to the fatty acids rising in serum? Is there any low ATP in the cell, any warning signs of that? That's where I would just treat those blood levels with caution. But of course, I will typically lean on the combination of the blood levels, the malic acid status from the organic acids test, and of course, what are we seeing? What problems are they experiencing? What's the symptom profile? So, what about yourself?
So I think this is important for the people listening and watching, is that we're not talking about one marker to define things, right? I think what Malik and I are both talking about is we're looking for patterns of issues. Like, do we have a common theme? So does my patient have hypothyroid symptoms, right? Signs and symptoms. Do they have some hyperthyroid symptoms that might also indicate, hey, we do have a stress response here, so the physiology is not in homeostasis. We do want to look at a full thyroid panel, but all the labs mean something, and they all need to be interpreted, because you could have a normal TSH but low free T4, low free T3, or you could and why would you have a normal TSH if those values are low on a lab report? Well, first of all, if it's normal and you didn't run the rest of the panel, you wouldn't see that the rest of the labs are normal. But the most common condition we have is chronic inflammation. That's the biggest problem we have across the board. And if inflammation early on suppresses TSH because it increases the conversion of T4 to T3 at the hypothalamus, you're going to hide a thyroid condition, even if the thyroid gland is struggling, even if the peripheral tissues are struggling, if you only run the TSH. So we need to look at TSH. For me, when I'm looking for markers of cellular or tissue hypothyroidism, I definitely look at T3, free T3, reverse T3, and then I look at the ratios of free T3 to reverse T3, T3 to reverse T3, and T3 to T4. If there's a common theme there, low T3, free T3, and we're talking about optimal ranges for people to understand that lab reference range, it is really, really rare for T3 to drop and free T3 to drop below the lab reference range. They're not great ranges. They're kind of disease-based ranges. Nobody pays much attention to them, but the cellular physiology will defend the T3 levels the best it can. So it's rare that it gets too low, but you start seeing that free T3 drop under 3. You see that T3 total dropping under 100. You know you're getting poorer conversion. And when you start to look at the ratios of that, like I explained, those are good indicators. The other things that I look at is I'll look at the inflammatory markers on the blood work. Do I have markers of inflammation or oxidative stress on a blood panel that's going to potentially influence those thyroid values? So do I have high insulin? Do I have high leptin? Do I have elevated uric acid? Do I have elevated fibrinogen, elevated ferritin, CRP, homocysteine? If I have some of those markers showing inflammation, I know I've got a stress response going on. The other thing we'll take a look at is I'll take a look at tissue indicators of hypothyroidism. So one of the best things to look at is your cholesterol and LDL levels. Now, I don't fall for the cholesterol needs to be under 200, LDL needs to be under 100 nonsense, but I think anytime you see a rise of cholesterol and LDL and you have indications of tissue hypothyroidism, you know that the liver demands a ton of T3. And if you have a low T3 state at the liver, you're going to have higher cholesterol and higher LDL. Why? Because the LDL receptor on your liver, that the LDL that's carrying the cholesterol has to dock to dump off the cholesterol into the liver so it can go into your bile, needs T3. So as the T3 status of the liver goes down, cholesterol and LDL build. They're not bad. They're not getting done what they need to get done. And the body also doesn't have the appropriate metabolism in manufacturing mode to make that cholesterol into the hormones and neurotransmitters and other things we need because there's a low T3 state. Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. The conversion of cholesterol into pregnenolone, which can now then flow into the rest of that steroid hormone cascade. Well, what hormone is the one that does that conversion? It's our good friend T3. But yeah, you mentioned a really good point about the cholesterol and, of course, building that pattern with the inflammatory markers as well. And yeah, one thing that is also worth saying is that I don't see any concerns with cholesterol itself. Cholesterol is an ambulatory hormone. It's there to help when needed. It's there to supply the membranes of the cells with the fatty acids they need. It's there to supply various different regions with the fat soluble nutrients they need to conduct repair process, so on and so forth. Of course, if there is too much of it and then there's oxidative stress and we get the oxidized LDL, well, then there's something for us in there. But in the main, it's simply a clue that, as you said, something that should be happening at the liver isn't. And so, in that regard, is it too much energy? Insulin signaling potentially playing a role, or simply consuming too much, which is actually a lot less common? Is it a lack of being able to process it, T3, or indeed are we looking at actual inflammatory issues locally at the liver, potentially due to gallbladder issues that are now causing cellular injury? In any case, it's going to be one of those almost every time, and often a combination of those. As we've touched on, there's so much crossover. So I think that it's just so important to build a picture using the tools that we've got available. And we do live in a time where we've got a stunning array of tools available, and equally to recognize that when we're seeing these issues, these are all clues. They're telling us what is the body trying to do, and then in that regard, well, why? What signals are inducing this sort of response? What's forcing it into this compromised scenario where it's having to downregulate the energy it uses there, using thyroid system to regulate that? What's actually inducing that, and how does that then play out at the liver? How does that play out with the inflammatory markers that you mentioned? So it's as much as the details do very easily get complex, the principles are always simple, and that nothing happens without a reason. Regardless of how complex the scenarios have been and how chronic the conditions have been when people have come there, nothing happens without a reason. And yeah, as you say, it's often this shrug that we get from mainstream medicine when people don't fit into the box. Well, maybe that's just, how things are for you. Well, they weren't for the first 26 years of life. So what happened then? Something changed that forced the body into an adaptive response, one that would be adaptive in the short term, but is actually being sustained for too long, has then had downstream effects. And if we are particularly unlucky, will then contribute to further dysregulation of the type that can now fuel that initial problem that we are seeing. So yeah, the pattern building and just recognizing that the answers are always there if we actually stop and connect up all of these apparently separate clues, which are never separate.
Right. So let's finish it there, because we could go another hour, but I'm up against the hard stop. So Malek, let people know where they can find more information about you. Do you have a website? Where can they go to learn more about Malek?
So I am at marekdoyle.com, and I've got a selection of articles on there for anyone who's found this particularly interesting. I've also got information on my training program for practitioners and enthusiasts. Also, I am on Instagram, Marek Doyle Nutrition. So any thoughts, questions, comments, fire them at me.
Awesome. So thanks for coming on the podcast. And for people who tuned in, listen to this, you might need another run through this one because we got a little heavy, a little deep. But what we're trying to do is provide answers. I think that the comforting thing is I talk about this all the time. Now you have somebody else kind of talking about that from the same perspective. To be fair, I didn't know Malek's perspective coming into this conversation, but it seems like they're fairly similar ideas and concepts, so that the root of a thyroid problem isn't you didn't wake up and your gland just decided to call it quits in one day, but there's some type of cell stress, adaptive responses going on, and hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism or thyroiditis or autoimmunity is a consequence of the adaptation. So the solution isn't to manage the dysfunction as much as it is in functional medicine to get to the root cause, restore more normal physiology. And what I see and what Malek sees is, hey, these thyroid problems start to reduce. People need less thyroid medication. The signaling works better. And in time, they need less and less medication often. Malek, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was great having you come on. We could have done another hour, but maybe we'll get you back on in the future. Okay?
Well, always happy to do that. Thanks for having me on. And until next time.
Until next time. Take care.